So in case you don't know, Justin is a writer, a speaker, a broadcaster, a podcaster. Anything else?
I think you covered most of it there.
And I just want to thoroughly recommend his podcast, which is called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, which I have been very much enjoying. So thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
Based on the book.
It is, yeah.
Based on the book. And Justin will be around for a bit longer this morning. And if you'd like to purchase that book or his other book called Unbelievable, then Justin will be over there, happy to sign any books as well. So, Justin, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
You're very welcome. So, some people may know a little bit about the podcast or, you know, some of the work you were doing on Premiere, Unbelievable. Could you, for everybody, give us a little overview on what you've witnessed, probably from your unique position, over the last 20 or 30 years of the kind of the rise of atheism, church decline, highly secularized culture, and then potentially a sea change. Just give us a little overview if you could.
Yeah, so for about 17 years, I hosted a show called Unbelievable, which brings Christians and non-Christians together for dialogue and debate on Premiere. And really, that began in what was the new atheism. So this was a point when there were a lot of quite full-on dogmatic atheist instigators who were out there, people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, writing these best-selling anti-God books. And some of the manifestations of the new atheism, you know, were felt, say, here in London. You might remember the Atheist Bus campaign with the red London buses bearing the slogan, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." So this was quite a sort of in-your-face public form of atheism. I think that was what was new about it. It was very dismissive of religion. In fact, you know, went out to ridicule religion in many ways. So that was the kind of the nature of the conversation on faith that was kind of in the public sphere at the time I started the show. And a lot of the conversations reflected the tenor of that debate. We had these quite bombastic, you know, new atheist figures opposite Christian thinkers. But over the years I was hosting the show, I did notice a change in the sort of the atmosphere of the way the conversations were being had, especially in the latter years of the show, where I was often meeting non-Christians, but non-Christians who weren't necessarily dismissive of religion, in fact, quite often recognized the value of Christianity, especially culturally. So I started to have more of these sorts of more nuanced conversations with people like Tom Holland, who was here last night, Douglas Murray, Jordan Peterson, the psychologist, and others who wouldn't necessarily call themselves Christians or Orthodox Christians in a way, but were nonetheless drawing quite large audiences and recognizing, I think, to some extent, that new atheism had sort of faded out of view a bit, or that it really hadn't provided the answers that people were looking for. And I noticed, from the sidelines, in a way, the new atheism itself kind of internally collapsed. There was, quite an interesting kind of period of time when suddenly, having agreed that God didn't exist and religion was bad for you, thereafter, a lot of these new atheist figures couldn't agree on much else, because it turned out that you need more than just a denial of God to sort of build something worthwhile. And they split over all kinds of issues, what we might call culture war issues now. And you had some who went in a very kind of progressive direction, others who went in a very anti-woke direction. And today, most of those new atheists really aren't really criticizing institutional religion anymore. That's not, they've kind of just taken sides in the culture wars. So what happened, I think, is a kind of, that movement really faded away to some extent. And it's been replaced, I think, by a far more interesting kind of conversation where a lot of secular intellectuals I'm meeting are sort of taking Christianity far more seriously. And so a lot of the book is sort of, well, firstly, it's sketching out this kind of rise and fall of new atheism, but then a lot of the book is actually about the ways in which I'm seeing in lots of different spheres a new conversation about the value of faith from some of these secular intellectuals. And indeed seeing some surprising conversions as well, people who you might not expect to embrace Christianity, but who are. And I think that's an interesting moment for the church to be looking at and realize that actually the conversation does move on. Culture changes around us, and we need to be careful not to be answering the questions of yesterday. We need to be kind of looking at where people are now.
That's brilliant. That's really, really helpful. So in all of that, in all those conversations that you've been privy to, kind of things that you've seen, What is it that encourages you the most? You know, what is it when you've seen people maybe take that step to Christ or maybe taking steps towards Christ? What encourages you the most in what you see?
Well, I started this podcast series, which is really a sort of long-form version of the book, really lots of interviews with some of these figures, but also with some of the converts that I've met along the way. And their stories are obviously very encouraging, but perhaps even more encouraging is when I've had a lot of people responding to the podcast. And a lot of them are agnostics who are saying, actually, I feel like I'm in that place. I can no longer be satisfied with the sort of secular material story of reality. I feel like it's let me down. Look at our culture, it's kind of coming apart at the seams. The more technology and science and quote unquote reason we feed in, apparently that doesn't solve things, you know. And so I just feel like even in the response I've had, there's just been such an interesting response of people saying, I feel like I'm in this story that you're telling. And indeed people who have crossed the line and said, actually, I've just started coming to church. Now this isn't like a flood of people, but I do think it's a sign that something's changing in the atmosphere, because when I look back 10, 15 years ago, when New Atheism was at its height, I wasn't having those kinds of conversations. That wasn't the sort of the atmosphere. Certainly you wouldn't have expected to see, as we did, you know, here last week when I had a conversation myself with Tom Holland, you know, 600 people, a lot of them non-Christians, coming out to listen to what was being said. So I'm quite excited that something is happening in that way.
That's brilliant. So most people here are involved in local church, leading local churches. I think your wife leads a local church. That's right. So help us. This is fantastic on an intellectual level. We're very encouraged by these conversations, reading the book. How do you think that then translates to the local church? What can the local church take on board? How can the local church be encouraged? Maybe what can a local church do? You know, if there's this tide change, this sea change, how does that then impact on the ground local church?
And I've had a lot of people ask this, because a lot of people are wondering, is this just a kind of slightly high-level academic conversation, you know, intelligent people like Tom Holland saying nice things about Christianity? I think it's more than that. I think that there is definitely a sense in which, firstly, a lot of these figures have huge platforms. You know, Tom Holland obviously co-hosts The Rest is History, and he's often used that to talk about his thesis about Christianity. Jordan Peterson, whether or not you kind of like the guy, he's got a huge following on YouTube, and you know, I was one of 13,000 people watching him at the O2 in November, you know, and he's there just on stage talking about meaning and purpose and God and the Bible. So as I say, I feel like there is something, you know, the church can be looking for. We need to be asking ourselves, what's going on? Why are people turning out for this? And I think a lot of the attraction, to some extent, especially with the kind of Jordan Peterson phenomenon thing, it's about people looking for identity. I think we're living in a very confusing culture for people, where a lot of the roles and the kind of ways in which people, you know, have traditionally thought of themselves are being questioned, being overturned. And in my view, everyone needs a story to live in, but people don't know what story they're supposed to live in anymore, because you've got a smorgasbord of lots of different options today, and it's basically a pick your own adventure. And that, I think, is actually contributing to the mental health crisis, especially among young people, because I don't think we're made to create our own story. We're meant to live in a story that's already been kind of written for us and that we're invited to step into. And that is obviously the Christian story. And I think one of the opportunities for the church here is to say to people, there is a better story. And when you're meeting people who are in the midst of this meaning crisis, this mental health crisis, I think we've got the answer. Now, the question is, how effectively are we presenting it, and what can we do to kind of perhaps show people that it is a compelling answer to what they're going through. I think there's some interesting lessons I've learned from some of these secular intellectuals, as I say, they're all on different places. Some of them are kind of, I think, like Christianity, but aren't that interested about jumping in. I think others are kind of hovering on the edge, you know, and thinking, actually, this makes kind of cultural sense, psychological sense. It might just be true. And I think there are people who have kind of embraced it as well. And the people who are kind of hovering on the edge, often what they've said to me, they said, if I'm attracted by church, but there are also things that don't attract me. And that's when the church just basically looks like the culture. I can already get that, when I walk out the door. I want something that's different. The way Douglas Murray put it to me, he said, I want Christians to keep Christianity weird, he said, because otherwise it just looks like everything else that's already on offer. Now, for some, that's a kind of an aesthetic thing. Tom Holland, if you were here last night, perhaps told you about the church that he's been attending, which is a very high church. And I think he's interested in that because it is kind of quite otherworldly, the choral music and the incense, and it kind of transports him. But I think there's also a sense in which people don't just want a church that simply, culturally and ethically just capitulates in every way to the culture. Even though that can be a challenge, we think, well, we need to make it completely acceptable to everyone. Then people will come. I think actually it's the opposite. I think their eyes glaze over because it just looks like just another what's already on offer. So a lot of these secular intellectuals, they've specifically said, I won't be attracted to church if it's just aping the culture, basically. So I think that's important for the church to recognize that it's okay to be weird. Yeah. In fact, that's why the church grew in the first century. It was very weird. Yeah. And sometimes we need to embrace our weirdness.
That's very good. Which is very similar to what Tom Holland said last night. Exactly that. Continue to be weird. and the other point that he brought out when he was on this stage last night was the whole supernatural element. Yeah. The supernatural element that Christianity has. Don't shy away from that. Don't hide that away. There's something otherworldly. There's something that is supernatural that the church has that other institutions, culture, doesn't have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of and probably I'm just repeating what he said last night here, but again, in the conversation we had, he said the problem, in a sense, with the Christian church is it's been so successful that now what made it incredibly distinctive in its early years, its attitude towards women and children, the disadvantaged, the way it sought to raise up the vulnerable, is that is now just, of course everyone believes that now. That's kind of what our society is essentially founded on. So the question is, how can the church still look distinctive? Because everyone sort of believes actually now the ethics of the church at that level, but they've forgotten that it came from the Bible. They just think, oh, this is just the way life is. I think what's interesting is, in a way, as we move increasingly into a post-Christian culture and other possible worldviews come into view, whether it be Islam or sort of very progressive ideologies or, other hegemonic powers like China, Russia, it's becoming more apparent to people that the gift of kind of our belief in equality, human rights, compassion, that's not necessarily a given. There are other ways of looking at the world and life. And I think that, again, is something the church needs to help people, to remind them, in the way Tom Holland has, that this didn't come out of a vacuum. It came from a very specific story. Yeah. And it might be worth looking at that story again in that way.
That's brilliant. A couple of other things. So, again, from a church perspective, when we look at this kind of slight sea change, tide maybe coming in, new opportunities, but also a kind of a reckoning that maybe some of the objections and some of the kind of narratives have changed. So when we look at our evangelism, when we look at church outreach, so many of us have used Alpha over the years, which has been absolutely amazing. Is there something that needs to go before that? Is Alpha too big a jump? Is it too much assumed knowledge? Is there something that would need to fill that void? Just trying to think practically again for our churches, engaging with the culture. That would be most of our go-to.
Yeah. I mean, I would say if it's working, then obviously keep using it. And I think Alpha still is incredibly effective in lots of circumstances. I think probably for me, and when we've used Alpha, the key thing really is the relationships. That's always kind of, it's the relationship building that's key. And if you like, then what you learn in the session is at some level secondary, but obviously important. And I think that's an important thing to recognize is people still craving relationship. And in an increasingly digital world where person-to-person contact is actually becoming more and more rare, I think the church does have a unique position where we still believe in the meeting place and people who are very different from each other actually coming together and learning from each other and gathering around something that's bigger than ourselves. So I think whatever it is, it's going to still be about relationships and that kind of thing. And I think that's only going to become more important as we live in this increasingly kind of echo chamber, social media world. Having said that, I think a lot of people are no longer, I think a lot of our evangelism has to some extent traded on the fact that there's still a residue of kind of Christian understanding.
Yep.
But even that, I think, we're starting to lose in our culture. So it's not just that people are unchurched. It's like they've never really had any kind of church experience at all. And so I think we probably do have to bear that in mind. Now, I think that isn't only a kind of a bad thing. In some ways, it might also mean people have less presumptions about what the church is and what Christianity is. I think sometimes the first thing you have to do with a lot of people who do have a bit of a kind of connection with Christianity, they've often picked up a kind of a false version of what it is. Oh, it's just about, being good and you'll get to heaven. It's, it's something that old people do in a crusty old building. Whatever it is, sometimes you have to sort of work to take down those assumptions about it and show them something different. Often, I think these days people don't even come with those, So that can be actually a positive. What I think one of the things for me is, especially with the shift in the conversation, I spent a lot of time in my life doing apologetics, which is basically giving people intellectual reasons to believe, answering some of their sort of intellectual objections and so on. And I think that was quite important to do, especially in the new atheist era, because that was kind of where the conversation was. I think, though, the conversation, as I say, has moved on. And I think that one mistake we might make in our evangelism is to assume that those are the questions people are asking right now. Give me evidence for the existence of God. Give me 3 reasons to believe in the resurrection or whatever.
Yep.
Now, if someone's actually asking that, great. It's good to provide those. But actually, that's not where I think most people are starting. I think what we're seeing a lot of these secular intellectuals tapping into are far more just basic existential questions about what's the purpose of life? Give me a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Why do I feel so depressed? And I think that's actually where we probably need to start with a lot of people. And that's about actually starting with the things that do kind of fire them, the interest they have. They're probably not going to be asking you, does God exist? That's probably not the place they're starting. But obviously God is going to be the answer to whatever the thing is that they are facing in their life. To that extent, I think one of the things I think the church could do better maybe or could focus on is kind of using the imagination as much as the intellect when we present Christianity to people.
Yeah.
I think don't necessarily start with a kind of here's the biblical evidence for Jesus kind of thing. That you might want that, but I think where you want to start probably is tapping into the fact that people actually want this story to be true.
Yeah.
So the person who did this brilliantly, of course, was C.S. Lewis, who sort of did write great books of apologetics explaining Christianity, but he also wrote the Narnia stories, and he kind of made people wish that there was this magical place with fauns and talking animals and a just but not tame lion king. And of course, he gave, by kind of creating a world like that people wanted to exist, he kind of helped them to see that, well, what if this world really did exist? And I think that's part of the challenge, is to make people wish that it were true, and then do that kind of work of showing that it actually is true.
Brilliant.
And that's about meeting them where they are in their passions, in their love of, it might be music or theatre or art or sport or whatever it is, and show how that their deepest interests and longings actually are reflected in some way in the Christian story. They don't make sense in a purely kind of atheist, materialist kind of world,
That's brilliant. That's so helpful. Thank you, Justin. Just one more thing I want to kind of hone in on. So our title for this conference is Ekklesia. That's the name of the Church Leaders Conference in Butner of. And then it's confident and creative local churches that shape, transform the world. So you've talked a little bit there about creativity. But my experience as a church pastor is that so many Christians are struggling with being confident in their faith. They feel battered by society. They feel battered by all kinds of points of view about everything under the sun. A lack of confidence. How would you help someone to say, hey, you know, in 2024, you know, different landscape to maybe early days of, you know, all the apologetics, but in 2024, how can you be confident in the Christian faith? I mean, there's brilliant stuff in your book, but how can you live out a confident Christian faith in the society, in the social media, in the internet world? What does that look like? 'Cause I think confidence is something that so many Christians lack.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because I think the danger for the church is to become as jittery and nervous as the rest of the culture.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's this kind of low-level fight or flight sort of response, I think, going on in a lot of our culture. And I think the church can often feel like, you know, threatened and hemmed in and kind of react in the same way. And I think we have to obviously turn to Jesus, who somehow was able to live under pressure, but in a way where he was just still open to people wherever they were. And he had that kind of, I guess, humble confidence, you know, that he knew what he was here for, and whether people agreed with him or not, he was there to meet people. And I think actually we might be surprised if we kind of get out of the social media echo chambers that often give us a false impression of what's going on in our culture, and actually meet people, as I say, and form the relationships. There's actually a lot more openness, I think, very often to things than you might imagine. And to that extent, I think the church should be demonstrating that ability to transcend these culture wars and so on. And to, yes, stand firm on what it believes, but do it in a way that's very different to the kind of warring that we see online and in politics and elsewhere, to show that actually it's possible to do that with grace and love. And the church itself, for me, it has to be a place where it kind of counters cancel culture. And I think that exists on both the left and the right. There's a kind of very kind of zero-sum game where we will, you know, cast this person as a Nazi and that person as a demon. And the church has to do something different to that. There has to be the possibility for redemption, grace, every person being made in the image of God. If you just look at every single person as being made in the image of God, that has to change the way you engage with them. And for me, it's definitely about knowing what you believe and why. So it's important to kind of have that, you know, have some of those intellectual tools to know what, you know, so that when you have a conversation, but it's about it's the way you say it that makes such a difference. The way that humble confidence that comes from knowing that it's not ultimately about winning an argument or beating someone on Twitter or whatever. It's actually your identity is in Jesus, and so you can leave it with him, you know, at the end of the day. And I just want Christians to kind of, you know, I've forgotten who says it might be John Mark Comer or someone else, but we need this non-anxious presence in the world. We need to show that if this is true, you can live differently to the rest of the world. And I just think the world needs to see that. Whether we feel like we're doing well or badly when it comes to the statistics, that's what we're being called to be, is this faithful, non-anxious presence.
Brilliant. Thank you. Just before we close, could you tell us one of the stories, maybe, just to encourage us, from someone that you've met over the last kind of 10, 20 years that you've seen on that journey of faith that has come to Christ? Just I think it would encourage everyone. You know, you've been privy to some incredible conversations. So,
well, if I've got time, I'll tell you two short ones. Because one story is someone I met in the heyday of New Atheism, a friend of mine called Peter Byram, who sort of had a sort of Christian background growing up, but basically lost it when he went to university and very much fell in with the New Atheist thinking and books, became convinced that religion was a delusion. But it was actually in the process of actually watching on YouTube and elsewhere some of these well-known atheist, that he then stumbled across Christian apologetics and some actually reasonably good arguments he discovered for Christianity in response. And that led him on a whole journey where even as an agnostic, he was working alongside me on some of my projects and really interested, came on my show, and eventually in 2011 got to the point where he realized, you know what, I think I've changed my mind. I think I believe this now. And I now work alongside Peter. He's a colleague of mine, but he was just a classic example of the way God, works, that actually it was through Richard Dawkins that he actually came to faith in a strange turn of events.
I love that.
So that happens, but then more recently, really interesting story that I do tell in the book of a celebrated sort of author and poet called Paul Kingsnorth here in the UK, who is just has the most interesting story of having developed a very kind of glittering literary career, but also an activist when it comes to ecology and the environment, and went through various phases, sort of teenage atheism at one point, where he just sort of, what he saw in school of church just like completely put him off it, basically. And then in a long period as a Buddhist, kind of trying to find purpose and meaning, but kind of looking within for that. But eventually finding actually that still didn't make sense. He realized he wanted to worship something. So he thought, well, maybe I could worship nature, because he was really connected with nature. He loved being outdoors. That was where his environmental sort of drive came from. So he actually started practicing Wicca, going into the woods, kind of doing sort of incantations and things. And he came to realize fairly quickly it was a kind of strange pastiche of things. But it kind of, it interested him for a while. Eventually, though, he had a thriving kind of writing school, and he started to get lots of messages from people who were reading his work who were Christians. And he was wondering, why are all these Christians coming out of the woodwork? One day at dinner, his wife, who was not a Christian, said, "You're going to become a Christian." And he said, "What are you talking about?" Like, that was not on the agenda whatsoever for him. And then he started having dreams about Jesus. And gradually, through a whole series of circumstances, he said he basically got dragged kicking and screaming kind of out of Wicca and embraced Christianity. He's become an Orthodox Christian now, and he's just a fascinating writer and has a fascinating story, and has absolutely jumped fully into Christianity. So if you get a chance to read his essay on this, it's called "The Cross and the Machine." I find it incredibly encouraging, but also challenging, because he's someone who's saying, look, if the church is going to be the church, it has to look different to the culture. And but I find surprising stories like his do encourage me that something's going on.
Brilliant.